Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this ATTA webinar this morning, our monthly webinar for December. My name is Kirsten Bayer with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. Today's topic is parent perspectives on post-secondary transition, and we are joined by a great panel of parents today, so you'll be hearing from them. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. As a reminder, all participants on the webinar are in listen-only mode. If you have questions as the webinar proceeds, please post those in the question chat box. This is simply just a text box, and it might be labeled something different depending on if you're joining us from your computer or your phone or a tablet this morning. But it's a text box, and it might be labeled question, comment, or chat on your screen, but you can chat with us through that and ask any questions, and we will address them at the end of the webinar during our Q&A. Just another couple housekeeping things. This webinar is being recorded, and today's recording and the presentation materials will be available on our ATTA website, as well as our ICSPS website and our YouTube channel as well. So you can watch the recording, share it with family and friends as you see fit. Tomorrow, each attendee will receive a follow-up email, which will include a survey asking about today's webinar. If you could please provide feedback and suggestions, and I'm going to put that survey link in the chat towards the end of the webinar. If you have a couple minutes today to give us that feedback, that would be great. It will really help our ATTA professional development team for the future. And then with that, I'm going to hand it off to our presenters today. We have Carissa Melody, who is from our team, and Jennifer Phillips, who is also from our team at ICSPS. And then we are also joined this morning by Libby Rav. So I'm going to have Carissa introduce everyone. Carissa?
Thank you so much, Kirsten, and good morning. I'm Carissa Melody. Welcome to our roundtable discussion on parent perspectives. I'm here today, like she said, with Libby Rabb and Jennifer Phillips, two amazing women, both parents of sons on the autism spectrum. I'm going to let them introduce themselves to you shortly. Rod Page says there is no more powerful advocate than a parent armed with information and options. Next slide, please. So this webinar is brought to you by the Autism Training and Technical Assistance Project, ATTA, and in partnership with the Illinois State Board of Education and the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Supports at ISU. Go ahead, next slide. Thanks, Kirsten. So today we'll talk about the process of transition. We'll get some tips and tricks from parents and some current statistics and see some applicable resources and learn more about the supports that are available out there. So autism spectrum disorder is a broad spectrum. An individual with the same diagnosis has needs that are very unique to them. If you've heard this quote by Dr. Stephen Shore, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Autism is a lifelong impact. It's not always recognized at childhood. It's a condition both of behavior and social communication and social connection. Additionally, 69% of individuals with autism do not have an intellectual disability. So in a nutshell, transition services promote the movement from post-secondary education, vocational training, integrated employment, and community participation. So the transition from high school to college or the workforce can be a very difficult time, but it can also be a very rewarding time. So I'm just going to go over some of the statistics. In March of 2020, the ADDM, Autism Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network, identified 1 in 54 children with autism spectrum disorder. So as we become better at recognizing the symptoms of autism, we become better at diagnosing, which leads to more people being identified. And so here's some more statistics done by the Drexel University. So Drexel University has a life course outcomes research program. And they are reporting these findings from the National Autism Indicators Report. And they're based on individuals that are using state developmental disabilities services. And of course, these services vary for each individual, and there are still waiting lists for some of these services. So 55% of parents participated in IEP transition planning, and 1/4 of high school students did not participate in their own transition planning. And over 60% of individuals do not transition to work or continued education within the first couple of years after high school. And only 14% have paid and community-based jobs. These numbers are very hard to take in. So what can we do about it? So as I stated earlier today, I'm here with Jennifer Rabb and Libby Phillips. I just mixed that up. I'm here with Libby Phillips and Jennifer. I just did it again. Libby Rabb and Jennifer Phillips. I've known Libby now for about 12 years. I had the pleasure of teaching her son Bryce in 5th grade. This was my very, very first year of teaching. So I was overplanned and out to save the world, and my aides were laughing at everything I had planned for these kiddos. Bryce was very significant in teaching me a ton about autism and teaching each individual child. And he's now a super senior, aging out of his high school transition program. And then Jennifer's a coworker of mine. Although Jennifer and I haven't met in person due to working remotely at home, we've had so many conversations about transition and autism, and we've shared some great resources. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves to you. So Libby, why don't you start and just tell me a little bit about yourself and your son and maybe what state of transition you guys are in.
So I'm a mom of 2 adult men. My youngest son, Cohen, is 19, and he's typical in every way. And my oldest son, Bryce, is 21, and he is autistic. I am passionate about informing families with special needs, just giving them information. Many years ago, I started with my friend Laura a special needs parent group in our school district, and that transformed into a special needs information fair that's been running for 14 years now that highlights organizations from around Central Illinois that offer services to individuals with special needs from birth through employment. My son Bryce was the first child to be diagnosed with Easter seals in January 2003 when he was 3.5, and he has gone on to be a Special Olympian since he was 8 years old. He has been involved in the Penguin Project, which is a nonprofit that does Broadway musicals that stars children with disabilities. Bryce has been in 7 productions of the Penguin Project, and he has actually had speaking roles in 5 of them. He is he's just a really fun kid. He loves to paint. His biggest joy is sweeping my house every day. He loves to go hiking. He loves to plan vacations. He loves to travel. He is currently, as you said, a super senior at Dunlap High School, and he'll age out in April when he turns 22.
Thank you. Jennifer, do you want to go ahead and tell us about George?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. So as Carissa mentioned, we're colleagues at the Center for Specialized Professional Support. I work more on workforce-related policy, but I do have my oldest son is on the spectrum. So this is our family. George is our oldest. We have 3 teenage boys. And in many ways, our 2 younger sons who are very neurotypical kind of remind us of, how George is different. So one of the things that is, there's a saying that Libby shared while we were practicing about, we're parents in the same ocean, the ASD ocean, but we're on different boats. And George's story is really kind of different from Bryce's, mainly because George was not diagnosed until he was 14 years old, roughly. So it's a little bit different story. But George was a very precocious kid. He really loved talking with adults more than his peers. And as a preschooler, was flagged for some social communication disorders, sort of the social pragmatics of not kind of understanding the back and forth of conversations, and then also something called sensory perception disorder. So, you know, as a young kid, he was kind of quirky and different, and we knew that, and we, no one was sort of pushing us into having George diagnosed on the spectrum, and actually it wasn't even called the spectrum back then. There were separate diagnoses for Asperger's and for autism. So it's a little bit of a different story, but I'm going to ask Kirsten to go to the next slide. And just, I wanted to kind of put this slide out there because, you know, for so many years of George's life, like we didn't have an ASD diagnosis. And the reason why I wanted to put this picture up here about sort of mild autism is, in many ways, someone who first meets George may not understand all of the underneath the iceberg pieces. And Kirsten, if you can go to the next slide, I'm going to explain what that means in introducing George. So as some people on this call might know, parents, teachers, other you know, stakeholders in the ASD community, ASD comes with high probabilities of comorbidities and other things. And so, as I mentioned, you know, George was diagnosed as a little kid with the social pragmatic disorder and the sensory perception disorder, but sadly, as a 12-year-old, he developed grand mal seizures and was diagnosed with a childhood form of epilepsy. And almost 1/3 of people on the spectrum are co-diagnosed with epilepsy. When we finally did a neuropsych evaluation, the thing that came as the headline was attention deficit disorder, not the autism. And that's also a co-diagnosis of, you know, between 30 and 61% of kids on the spectrum have that as a co-diagnosis. Also, you know, related to the epilepsy, George began to become a very anxious person. So our kind of free-spirited, quirky little kid up to 5th grade, 6th grade, you know, we entered the anxiety and depression realm, and there are very high co-diagnoses with anxiety and depression for people on the spectrum as well. So that iceberg that I was showing you, you know, George might present to the world a certain way, but underneath the surface of the water, he is struggling with many different things in addition to being on the autistic spectrum. So I just wanted to kind of give that as a sense of like how we're a little different from Bryce's story.
Sorry, I was muted. So I'd just like Kirsten to launch a couple quick polls just to get to know the audience a little better. So what is your connection to individuals with autism? Go ahead and check any that apply. I just kind of tried to make these real broad. Okay, good. We have mostly educators and quite a few parents or caregivers and some employers. That's amazing because I will talk about some of our upcoming webinars and y'all can be a part of that. There's something for everyone. So our next poll is just going to be, where are you located? Just check the most applicable. Again, I tried to go real broad, so I just went with northern, southern, central Illinois, and then the greater Chicagoland area just to see where our audience is. That's great. So really all over. I love that we're seeing some people from different areas. I know I've heard from some other webinars I've listened to that Southern Illinois might be a place that we want to try to reach out to more. So thank you so much for answering these poll questions. They'll help us with further webinars. So my next slide is just some survey results in preparation for the webinar. I sent out a survey to both friends and organization across the entire state of Illinois. And we really only received about 19 respondents. And even though I felt like that was a little low, I feel like I also received a very accurate picture and a wide variety of perspectives from parents and children across the whole autism spectrum with a broad range of abilities. So these findings are actually very similar to the national indicator reports. Some statistics that are not on this slide are that 63% of the parents that took the survey, their kids were diagnosed prior to age 5. 95% said that getting this diagnosis assisted with access to services. 79% said that it helped them in explaining some of their children's behaviors to themselves, and 63% said that it really helped in explaining some of these behaviors to others. So I'll let you kind of read through these. 89% are overwhelmed by transition planning. 53% found it difficult to find some information regarding transition planning. Communication was low, doesn't surprise us. I was excited that over 50% of our parents that were surveyed, their kids are over 50% independent in these living skills. And then social skills, I love that they can greet people appropriately. That's huge. Take some turns speaking. And then there's some definite deficits, which, like I said, match the indicators reports. 79% can ask for help. I feel like this is number one. If you can ask for help, then you're really able to get through some of those battles and challenges that you face. So the next slide is getting into the nitty gritty. Let's talk about planning and direction. So transition planning by law begins at age 14 and a half, where schools develop a transition plan as part of the IEP when most students transition from 8th grade to high school. So I have been a special education middle school teacher, so I'm very familiar with this process. For most students, you interview the student, the parent or caregiver, other teachers, and try to get to know their strengths and interests along with their abilities and qualities that would convert into a future employment goal. So in middle school, I feel like as a teacher, this was a best guess. I mean, you really try to make it relevant, but very few people know what their future plans are at this age. So I'd like Libby and Jennifer to walk us through their transition process when they started to think about their son's post-secondary future and kind of how they decided on this path for their son. So Jennifer, if you want to get us started, that'd be great.
Sure. Absolutely. Thank you. And thanks for presenting all the information on the slide before, because I think that even if you don't have a child with special needs, the whole process of life after high school is stressful anyway. And it just, having a child with special needs sort of adds an additional dimension of sort of parental anxiety and also like acknowledging what you don't know and that you need to kind of, take a couple extra steps in learning. So, so George is, so we literally George got a 504 plan just last year, and with the high percentage of educators on the call, you might sort of laugh at this, but one of the reasons for the 504 was really to let teachers know. So we'll talk about disclosure in a little bit, but it was a mechanism for letting teachers know that George had problems with like group work and things like that. The other kind of piece of George, planning direction is that he's we never had special services. We didn't have an IEP or a 504 for anything academic related. George has been, to this point, a very curious, intrinsically motivated student who has achieved very high levels academically. He was a couple grades ahead in math, so he took AP Calculus last year as a sophomore and AP Economics and aced both of the tests somehow without any help from us. But what I want to say as I kind of talk about like the planning and direction is that COVID has thrown him for just a massive loop. He's kind of gone into a very defensive kind of position. As I mentioned, George has struggled since 2014-15 with anxiety and depression, and George has been hospitalized twice for suicidal ideation and intention. One of the hard parts about the diagnosis, I think, for us as a family and, as me as a parent watching my son, is that George knows, between 5th grade and like adolescent, 6th grade, high school, he's come to realize how different he is and talks about how there's not really a place in the world for him. And so he's struggling with that sort of personal, future vision for himself. And COVID just has made it really, really difficult. So as I mentioned, like we did not have an IEP, but we have one now. And George has actually transitioned. He was hospitalized this September, and the school really encouraged us to move into the IEP process. And we are in the midst of that right now. The formal meeting is in January, but the school district gave a 45-day permission for him to enter a therapeutic high school. So he is now a student in a different high school than our district high school, and is receiving all sorts of sort of social and mental health supports right now. So we kind of leaning heavily into the mental health and social support side right now. So in terms of what kind of choices, and the other thing I should mention is that as a 17-year-old, George was just about to start applying for summer jobs last year, right? So he was just starting that process. And I think we'll get into some of the employer and the work related things in a second. But he was very much in the college bound side of things, college exploration, things like that. But this summer, actually through learning more about my colleagues in the ATTA project, my husband and I started looking more into the colleges that have additional programs and actually additional tuition for both mental health and ASD supports. So I think we're going to share some of that information in a second, but I do want to just call people's attention to the fact that I think it's in the chat that Kirsten put a set of slides that our high school used. So they recently did a session for kids with IEPs and 504s on post-secondary planning. So not just the college track, but sort of the whole picture, right? So community service jobs, apprenticeships, private sector employment, and going on to colleges and universities. So that set of slides is in the chat if people are interested in looking at it. And the things that were really eye-opening to us as parents were preparing ourselves for the difference between George being covered by the IDEA Act, right, like that legislation, versus being covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? So there is definitely, when I was saying before, like normal post-secondary planning for any parent involves a lot of research and like learning. This is another thing that is essential to really like know as a parent, like knowing the differences in the law that, the IDEA is school focused, ADA, it's kind of like independent, you're on your own, and that during this transition process that Carissa kind of tipped us off, like starting at around 14, that there's this movement away from like a kind of a basket of support mechanisms to this moving towards independence. And I'm sure Libby's going to talk about that in a little bit, about sort of aging out, you know, Bryce aging out of the super senior. But really arming yourself with information. I think Carissa said it in the beginning, like really making sure, you know, it's okay to say I don't know, and like looking for resources, having conversations with people, things like that have been super helpful. So that's a mouthful. I'm going to pause and let Libby have a turn.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer. And you're right. There's a huge difference between the free and appropriate education, and then, you know, you're on your own. The student is in charge post-secondary. So yes, so thank you so much. And we will get into more in a little bit. So Libby, if you want to start us out with just Bryce and your transition planning process and where you're at now.
Well, I think Jennifer hit the nail on the head there when she said, you don't know what you don't know, you know, and I think you need to rely a lot on people who've experienced before you. You rely on the teachers who have done this before. You have to rely on yourself to do your own prep work and research and to find out what's available out there. Our situation is different from Jennifer's. Seeing as Bryce was diagnosed when he was 3.5. He's been in school since he was 3. He's had an IEP since he was 3. And in the back of our heads, we always have known that someday, as they like to say, someday the school bus stops coming. You know, someday you don't want that day to end where your son falls off a cliff and then he graduates to nothing. And we always said Bryce is not going to graduate to nothing. But when he's 3, 4, and 5, it's hard to even think like, what is he gonna, you know, what is he gonna do? He has trouble, you know, a whole long list of things we're working on now. How is he ever gonna go to school or have a job? But at age 14.5, we did start that process with our middle school, and a lot of it was, you know, a lot of question asking, finding out like, are you interested in this? And a lot of it's finding out what it's not interested in. I think it's okay as a parent to take a breath and know that I'm overwhelmed when I think Bryce is going to be 22 and I need to know what he's going to do for the rest of his life. But I think it's also okay to know that what Bryce loves to do today may not be what he loves to do when he's 30. And it's okay to be open to the fact that what we decide to do now isn't for forever. And I think we'll talk about, you know, college bound and workforce bound in a minute. But I think as educators, or as parents, we rely heavily on educators to hold our hands and guide us here, because no one wants their child to graduate to sitting in front of the TV. That's not helpful for anyone. And we know that our kiddos have a lot to offer to, they have a lot to offer to the world, but it needs to be the right employer at the right time and in a position that they enjoy. And I don't want Bryce to be somewhere where he is just tolerated. I want him to be somewhere where he's celebrated. And I want him to be somewhere where people are really excited to see him come in. And I think we have that. I think we have that for him where he is today. He's in a good place. And when you're ready, I can talk about that. I didn't know if you wanted to move on to something else, but I can talk about Bryce all day.
Yeah, I know.
Can I piggyback on something that Libby just said?
Yeah, we'll keep talking about that. And when specifically, I guess you started to talk about the path. So after we're done with this planning and direction session, then we'll take some questions from the audience. I see that there's a lot of questions. So yeah, let's talk about specific preparations for Bryce and specific preparations for George as far as when you discovered they were college bound and workforce bound, and at the school were there specific classes that your counselor kind of helped you take the steps to that, and like Libby, a special program that Bryce was in. So yes, please, Jennifer, respond to Libby, and then go ahead and talk more specifically, and we'll wrap up this section and get some questions.
So it's really like about like sort of the diagnosis versus like the solutions, right? That, and this kind of piggybacks on what you just said, that, you know, I think both of us as parents are leaning heavily into our kids' assets. We know, we acknowledge the deficits for sure, and are focused on that, but really leaning into what they have to offer. And I just really love, this is a quote from Asperger experts, that if you had to choose between focusing all of your effort on pursuing a diagnosis or working with your child to build love and trust, always choose the latter, right? Don't get caught up in the trap of trying to find the right diagnosis before you shift your attention to actually helping your child do both, right? And that is, I think, in whether it's college bound or work bound or a combination of the two, because frankly, at our stage, at George's stage right now, I'm not sure what's going to happen. I'd like to think that when we're past COVID, that maybe he'll rebound to the person he was before March, but it's not really clear. And frankly, I think that, you know, once we get into some of the work-bound things, there are signs that were popping their heads up about him filling out applications that were causing red flags, or, you know, raising red flags for us about what kind of help or support he might need going forward. But anyway, I think it's like doing both. Acknowledge the diagnosis for sure, but like really lean into who your kid is.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
More to add.
No, I think that I think she hit the nail on the head. You know, when Bryce was little, our dream was always to start a business with him, and I think we will someday. I think, you know, when my husband retires, I think we'll have a family business that is all about Bryce and just about his passions and what makes him happy, because that's the key. We want him to have a purpose-driven life, and we want him to be happy doing it, just like everyone else. He's no different from my other son in that respect.
All right, thank you so much, ladies. I feel like our audience is probably getting a ton out of this, and we'll talk some more about the barriers and mental health soon. But the next slide just gives us an opportunity to get some questions answered. So let's pause now, Kirsten, and see if there's some questions from our audience that these ladies can answer, or I can answer.
Absolutely. So Wendy would like to know, where is the Penguin Project and how do kiddos get connected with them?
That's a great question. So the Penguin Project actually started in Peoria, but it's now in 40, I think it's in 43, or it's in 43 different sites around the US. I think it's like 16 different states. There's several here in Illinois, and I can get the information to Carissa, but if you look up thepenguinproject.org, you can find out how to start a chapter in your area, and it has been a really amazing time for us to watch our son with a disability to shine on stage. I'll tell you, I think he stole every show he was in, but that's just because I'm his mom. And you have a child who didn't speak for forever, who's memorizing lines and acting, and it is one of the most beautiful things that we've had an opportunity to witness our son do.
Yeah, and he might not have known how he blew the audience away when he was the UPS man in Legally Blonde, because he maybe didn't get some of the subtle innuendos, but he nailed it.
Okay, great. Tracy would like to know, how much did the students participate in the transition process starting at 14?
So
Well,
Libby, take that one, since we're not we haven't encountered it yet.
Sure. So I think it was just before that Bryce was starting to attend his IEP meetings. And basically it started at 14 and a half with questions, a lot of visuals, like, would you like to, you know, for example, do you like to work with animals? Would you like to work in a vet's office? Do you like to work with food? And I think it was just a matter of trying to gauge interests in where he would head through high school and beyond. And it started that way, just trying to find out where his interests were.
Yeah, and for us, because we're literally in the middle of creating an IEP right now, he has not gotten any special, like, he's done the guidance counselor things in the high school. He is pretty articulate about what his interests are in terms of engineering and economics, but we're just in a pretty murky period right now about how he's going to emerge and sort of what, you know, what's going to happen. The therapeutic school that he's in has a vocational counselor that he's just started to meet with, but we barely scratched the surface right now. He's barely scratched the surface right now.
And I'm not sure if you're a parent. Sorry, from the educator's standpoint, legally, you do have to interview the students. So like Libby said, with Bryce, it was just a series of pictures to get to know him better and what his interest might be. And then with verbal students or, you know, maybe higher functioning, then you could maybe do like an interview, sort of like a job interest questionnaire with the student and the parents.
And I would say as Bryce got older, like he was in high school, I should back up. He's been in a life skills program, so he wasn't doing like 9th grade work or 10th grade work, but he had a lot of enjoyment being in the cooking classes. Like he would go and cook, and he, you know, was learning to follow recipes and found a lot of joy with that. He was in all the art classes and he found joy with that. So it gave us an opportunity in high school to experience some different maybe job opportunities for him, different things that we could look at as time went on.
Great, thank you for sharing. Lisa would like to know, what do each of you feel is the most important thing that educators and support teams can do to help families heading into transition?
You know, that's a really great question. I think it's just really important to realize that in many ways the families are struggling too. Like we want to have all the answers. We want to do it what's right. You know, for me, my husband and I both have college degrees. I dreamt both my children would go to university. I never thought that one wouldn't. So there's a little bit of sadness in my heart knowing that Bryce won't have those experiences. I think it's important also to really know the child and know and to bring opportunities to the family so that they can help make the right decision for their children.
So I would ditto everything that Libby just said. I think that we're in an odd place where we've switched from traditional high school to therapeutic, but I think in both cases, teachers have an extraordinary ability somehow to connect with, upwards of 30 kids on an annual basis or a semester basis. I don't know how you all do it, but forming those connections has been just life-changing for George. So especially on the high school side of things, that some of the relationships that he's developed and sort of the support that he has felt from teachers has been, really helpful in terms of kind of helping him imagine what his next steps are. The other thing that I'll mention is that the ATTA project showed the documentary film Autism Goes to College in August. It's on the website, and I think you can still actually see the film through the ATTA project. And if you haven't seen it, it's so worth watching. And there are just these incredible interviews with, now, albeit this is the college, not the K-12, but the interviews with the teachers in that film just made my heart, like I cried in this movie because some of them were saying they wish they knew more, right? So George is that iceberg kid where your perception of him may not match the reality of him. And that the teachers in that film were saying that they kind of wish they knew more, and we're going to get into this in a second, that parents and students disclosed more, because if you lay your cards on the table, sometimes it's dangerous and risky, but sometimes there's a real reward in that kind of transparency and sort of greater, shared understanding.
Thank you so much, ladies. I'll just add, as a former special education teacher, I just feel like it's so important, like you said, to make connections and build relationships. And I've had parents bring to, a back to school night or an IEP meeting, just a folder about their child. Here's my child. Here's all their abilities and their really cool special interests. And it is so great to get to know the child, and in the IEP meeting, to help people feel comfortable, because parents come with a lot of anxiety because they want the best for their child, but teachers also come with a lot of anxiety because they want the best for this child. And just trying to build that relationship and find that common ground is so important, because you can do so much greater work together than you can separately. So that'd be my advice.
And I would add on to that we always wanted everyone working with Bryce to know that he's more than his diagnosis. That yes, Bryce is autistic, but he's also artistic, and he loves to walk his dog, and he is all these really cool, great things. He's a star on a Broadway shows, but he's also autistic. But that's when I introduce him, I don't say, this is Bryce, my son with autism. He that's part of who he is, but that's not what defines him. And I think we've always wanted anyone who's working with Bryce to understand that he is much more than a diagnosis.
Great, thank you. So there's a lot more questions coming in, Carissa. I don't know if we want to address them now or save them.
We can probably move on, because we are going to talk about some barriers and some other things that might answer some of the questions. So let's go ahead and move on. And then at the end, hopefully we'll have some time to take more questions. This was probably our biggest, most time consuming portion of the webinar. So now we'll talk about some barriers. We know that autism is a condition of both behavior and social connection, and these can present some barriers. So at the post-secondary level, individuals have to advocate for themselves. So having knowledge about autism, their skills and challenges really helps with their success. So self-advocacy talks about effectively disclosing their ability, communicating their needs and accommodations. They're going to need to make choices about what to eat, how to spend their free time, making decisions, their own decisions at the doctor's office, choices about their long-term planning, because once they're 18, they're considered an adult by law, and parents really don't have any rights to access their information. So independent executive functioning skills, tools like time management, organization, navigating social situation, mastering academic and job-related tasks also make a big difference. In this new phase, they might make new friends, they might get a girlfriend, they could develop some hobbies and find some jobs that match their abilities and skills. So we want to talk about some of these barriers and how you, Libby and Jennifer, have found some ways to help overcome or use accommodations for these barriers. So Jennifer, I'll go ahead and let you go first.
So, one of the things that we say about George a lot is that academically, George probably could be, perceived as like a 20-year-old, in that kind of realm. But emotionally and socially, he's sort of more 5 on a lot of things, right? So this is where thoughts about how to move into the workplace are actually give us more anxiety and stress than sort of the college related things, because he's kind of naturally gravitates to that sort of educational curiosity. Like if he makes it there, and right now he's just realized that as a 17-year-old he can drop out in January. So we're coping with that as well. And we just had, the IEP social history meeting this morning. And as I said, hopefully we'll have an IEP in place by January. We'll see. But the point is that he emotionally struggled, right? So one of the things that was really eye-opening to us this last summer is that a lot of online work applications have like these kind of like psychometric like little quizzes, and he has very few filters. He may not be so good at customer service because he's just so blunt with people sometimes. And so like those questions, he's like, Mom, I can't do this. Like, will you answer these for me? So that was one kind of barrier on the workplace side of things. On the sort of sensory side of things, George doesn't make great choices about like how he eats and taking care of himself. And we struggle on a daily basis, just like on like daily hygiene type things, right? Where he just sort of either forgets or he doesn't like the way it feels to do something. And those things are also going to present barriers in the workplace for sure, or we're foreseeing some things like that. One of the things that's a great resource on the ATTA website is this student self-assessment. If you haven't seen it, and you're looking as a teacher for something that you might want to share with a parent or a student, it's great because it's something that student can really kind of assess sort of where they are on a lot of different levels, both academically and hygiene and social and things like that. As parents, and as for George himself, he really liked doing that assessment. So that's a tool to kind of overcome some of these barriers. The other thing that we just learned about was the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, and thinking about other vocational. It doesn't have to be the Armed Services one, but other vocational kind of assessments that we might be able to do that take into account George's communication, behavior, and sensory issues. So I think I'll pause there and turn it over to Libby.
Thanks, Jennifer. It's I've enjoyed learning more about George. Different with Bryce, though. His greatest barrier right now is his communication skills. He's improving, and he's been improving, from the time we started speech therapy when he was 3. He has really good receptive language. His expressive language is better, but he needs the processing time. So he needs to be around people that understand that you can't ask the next question because he's working on that one still. You need to take that into consideration. He isn't capable of advocating for himself. He is in some ways. Like he'll tell you, like, I need a break, like if he needs to take a break, but he isn't. I don't think he would be able to go up to the teacher and say, I can't do this because I'm autistic. He wouldn't do that. He has had some pretty intense sensory issues, especially when he was younger. We've had many years of occupational therapy that have helped him. He's learned a lot of coping mechanisms to use when he needs to do that, or he'll say like, yeah, I'm gonna take a break, go in the restroom, or go for a walk, or I've actually found that his sensory issues have improved as he's gotten older. He had, as a young guy, and I put a lot of it as a lack of language. But when he was little, his behaviors were intense. But I think that has a lot to do with the fact that whatever he was trying to communicate wasn't making it through, and we would see it both at school, we would see it at home, and it's probably part of his whole world, struggling to communicate, struggling with the world around him, struggling with sensory. We always said, like, when the barometric pressure drops, it's not going to be a good day. It's going to be a bad day, because he feels that too. But I think the good news is we've seen improvements in all areas as he's gotten older. And so I think it's important for educators and parents to take away that just because the kiddo's stuck here today doesn't mean that's forever. That there's a lot of growth for improvement. Bryce is 21, and I don't see us plateauing right now. I feel like we're still chugging forward, and I think he's going to set this world on fire and do amazing things, and not just because I'm his mom, but I'm pretty proud mom.
Well, and just to piggyback on you, Libby, and I love hearing all the, there's so many similarities between George and Bryce. It's just fun to hear the stories, but, I think Carissa said in the beginning, like, ASD is lifelong, and I'm not sure there is a plateau ever, right? Like, George makes progress and has setbacks all the time, but like mostly progress. And there's always more to like learn. One of the things that George did last winter was a 16-week course on like social communication that UCLA did. I can put it in the chat. It's called Peers. But literally all it was a group that was practicing back and forth communication with each other, right? It's a simple kind of thing, but I think it points to the fact that like there's not a plateau, but there's always growth.
Thank you so much, ladies. That's so much great information. I hope this is helping everyone. So we're going to kind of move it along. We're running out of time, but so disclosure is completely personal. Jennifer has hit a little bit on it. There's some individuals with autism like Bryce who don't really understand that they have a disability to tell others that they need an accommodation. So some things to consider. We have a really great document on our website, which when we get up to our resources, I'll put up the link. It's just collegeandcareer.com, but it's Should I Disclose My Autism? And it just helps you think about considerations and suggestions, when to disclose, who should you disclose to, why should you disclose, and just if it would help you advocate for yourself better. So I know we've already discussed a little bit about disclosure. Do you ladies have anything to add other than what we've talked about already? We're getting close to the end. Sorry, guys.
One, it's a great resource. I have it right here. I think it's up on the chat. To the extent possible, like we've really encouraged, or we're trying to help George do the self-advocacy on like understanding what it means to disclose, and like him being empowered to make those choices. It's a luxury that we have because of, he can do that. But I think it's a really personal decision, but be armed with good information about when and how.
I agree with Jennifer on that. I think it's a private decision. In our situation, I believe people would realize pretty quickly if we didn't tell them that Bryce was autistic. But I feel like when you share that information, it brings understanding maybe to whatever situation you're in. And quite often, you find someone who's like, "Oh, my nephew is autistic," or this. It just. I think it sometimes can help a situation, and especially looking at future employers. In our case, it's important for them to know, because unlike George, I think Bryce is a little more obvious that he has special needs.
Yeah, I think, like Libby said, we're getting into a good time because the prevalence rate, you know, is getting higher, where we're identifying more people with autism. Then more of us know individuals with autism, even adults with autism, and so we're becoming more aware and more acceptable, and really employers and colleges are providing more supports and just some, you know, literature and resources to help individuals on the spectrum. So yeah, I think we're in a good time where we're really starting to, you know, just to see autism more. So the next slide just talks about some supports and how supports in high school are given by an entire team, your IEP, your academic team, and they are student-centered. And then after high school, we've already talked about that they're more student-led. So we have another good document on the ATTA website, which is just how to support changes from high school to college, and it just talks about some of the differences. So I think we've already talked about some of the supports that they have and accommodations we might need. So I might go ahead and go to the next slide, which is guardianship. So guardianship, it's also a personal decision. Statistics show that 40% of adults with autism have full guardianship and 13% have partial guardianship. I put a link on here, just a guardianship fact sheet, which is put out by the office, the illinois.gov. It's a real nice kind of just facts about the different types of guardianship and things to think about. Bryce is over 18, so Libby, if you're comfortable, you can talk about what you did for guardianship, and then Jennifer, you're approaching this stage and just how you're approaching it and what you think about guardianship. Whatever you feel free to share.
So we do have guardianship. My husband and I have a guardianship of Bryce. We went to the courthouse and obtained it when he turned 18. And basically it is, we felt, well, who better than us to care for him? And we felt that he isn't capable of making his own decisions when it comes to medical or financial, and that he will need supports the rest of his life for that. And I know I've shared the story before. 2 months after we got guardianship of Bryce, he broke his arm. And we rushed him down to the emergency room and to go to check him in, and the receptionist said, "Your son is 18 years old, you cannot check him in." And we're like, oh, wait a minute, you know, we have paperwork here that says that we can speak for him. Without that, Bryce could have just chosen to, no, I'm not going in, you know, I'm not going in there, I'm not going to do this, when clearly, you know, he needed help. For us, it was just a means of providing in a security for him for his whole life.
And for us, I have to thank Libby and Carissa, because I did not know about guardianship, and we're freaking out right now. George is turning 17. He's talking about dropping out, which, as people on this call know, means if he drops out, the IEP is out the window, and he'll be in the ADA world, not in the IDEA world. So we're just looking into this. The other thing that's like kind of similar but not exactly guardianship is sibling. So we haven't touched about that at all, but like siblings responsibilities and sort of planning related to helping a sibling as an adult is something that we've talked about with therapists, you know, in terms of future planning. That's maybe more on the estate guardianship side of things. But I have you guys to thank for tipping me off on the legal guardian.
There's a lot to think about, and this was one of the, on our survey, guardianship was one thing that people really wanted more information about. So hopefully these resources will help some of the people on this call and the people that took the survey. So the next slide is just resources that are specific to our ATTA website. Like I said, just go to that autismcollegeandcareer.com. When should I disclose my autism? Support changes from high school to college. The self-assessment document. There's interviewing tips, interviewing assessment to see where you're at in the interview and what you might need more supports with. There's a work environment assessment, which really assesses what type of environment do you work best in. Do you like a loud factory, or do you like to work by yourself in quiet? There's an assessment about your social communication in the workplace and just thinking about socially what you might need help with. I know when we did our survey, a lot of people had said there were some definite deficits when reading other people, and just perspective is really hard for people on the spectrum to take on the perspective of other people. And then so the next slide just has some other resources that are some of my favorite, just because they seem to be all encompassing. So these resources, the TAP program, just helps you find more information about the PUNs, which a lot of you had some questions about. Think College is a great resource that Jennifer introduced me to, which has where you can research colleges by state, and it has a lot of colleges that have some specialized programs for kiddos that aren't quite ready for full typical college, that maybe need some supports. There's some great colleges out there that have special programs for kids, which really teach them those executive functioning skills and how to, you know, schedule and plan and really get ready to do college. And then ARC of Illinois and ARC, you know, the National ARC website has some great resources. So the next slide is just some final thoughts and questions. We are out of time and we did not get to all of your questions, but we really want to answer all of your questions. So we look forward to looking at all your questions and answering all of your questions and getting those answers to you. So the next slide is just thank you so much for attending our website. Jennifer had put up all these great, just, you know, fun little sayings. Just hopefully you leave here with a better sense of the transition process and really believe that working with each other is the best way to help kiddos that are on the spectrum. So the next slide is just a big thank you for attending, and it has again our website listed, and for specific questions please feel free to contact me directly. Sign up for our future webinars. You'll find that on here. January we're going to focus specifically on transition to the workplace, and we'll feature Mark First, which since 1955 has provided resources to improving the lives of people with disabilities. And then February we'll focus on specifically transitioning to college, where we'll have representatives from Lewis and Clark Community College, and they'll be presenting on transition to college. So thank you so much for attending our webinar. And again, I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all your questions live. But look forward to hearing from us soon. So thank you, Jennifer and Libby. It was so great to hear your stories, and I know that you have helped so many educators and employers and other parents out there. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you everyone. And I did want to reiterate a couple things before we log off. You will be receiving a follow-up email tomorrow, and that will include the link that will have the slides, the resources from today, and the recording. So there's been a lot of questions in the chat about that. Where can we access this webinar? Where can we access these resources? The follow-up email tomorrow will have that direct link to where you can access everything from all the content from this session today. And then also it will have a follow-up survey in that email. And if you have very specific questions, feel free to ask those in that follow-up survey. And we also have these questions we have in the chat. We have access to those. So we potentially will look into doing an FAQ and sending that out to all of you who registered today as well. So we thank you for joining us this morning, and we hope to see you in January for our session in January. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your Tuesday.